So, Paul, thank you very much for joining us on the pod. It's great to have you. And I just wondered if you could kick off by telling us a little bit about your journey to becoming the group head of talent development at the theatre group and what part coaching plays in that.
Of course, well, it's a pleasure to be here, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me. It's rather a long journey actually, because I've been working for my organisation, the Ambassador Theatre Group, for 25 years. So, in fact, I started out as a box office assistant in the theatre in Woking, basically selling tickets. And I don't know, growing up, I'd had various career ideas, most of them outlandish. So I remember as a very small child, wanting to be an artist. That was the first thing I remember. If somebody asked me what I wanted to be, I wanted to be an artist. And then growing up, I was obsessed with films, filmmaking, loved film music, really obsessed with all of that. I wanted to be a film director, nice and easy. And then, later on at school, got really captivated by theatre. We had some really great English and drama departments that, we had trips to the theatre, and I was just blown away by what happened on stage. Did a little stint of acting, and then wanted to be a writer. So I wanted to be a playwright. went to uni, did writing and drama, these big aspirations. And, life continues, doesn't it? And lots of things happen. I met my wife at university. We had children, and then suddenly, it starts to get serious, doesn't it?
Indeed, yeah.
I need to make some money. I need a career. And so that's when I started. Well, I thought I'll work in theatre. It's the right building, potentially the wrong job. So I kind of worked my way through in lots of different positions. Within ticketing and sales to start with, and then I got to this point where I became a manager, and so this was a key moment, I suppose. And I see it in a lot of young people in our organisation as well. When you get that first promotion and you become a manager, and then there's this almost invisible pressure, and you kind of imagine. Well, I remember thinking, oh my God, I've got to be this kind of walking encyclopedia of knowledge. So
Indeed,
if
yeah.
somebody comes to me and asks me a question, I have to know the answer. And if I don't know the answer, then I'm abject failure, So it was really pressured. And I remember that step and how difficult it was. And then much later on, I think it was about 2006, I was invited to take part in, it was a 2-day kind of introduction to coaching that the organization was kind of experimenting with at that time. And I went along to it, and it just blew my mind, this idea that, oh my God, you don't need to know all the answers. And that, in fact, you can empower people by asking them questions, and so that they come to their own solutions. And the idea of actually, that idea of empowerment was really attractive. And then practicing it and seeing the results with teams and how much more engaged people were if you used your coaching skills. That was such an important moment. And then, I got fairly senior within sales. I was regional sales manager, looking after lots of different box offices. And then an opportunity came up in the HR department to retrain, to get qualified and become a generalist, which I did. And I started doing that. To be honest, I didn't really like it. I worried about the advice I gave to people when I was working in HR, because one little bit of information left out and it would completely change your the advice you were giving. And I found it really quite depressing working on disciplinaries and grievances and things like that, because I just felt, oh my, this is such a waste of talent, really. Some people have made some poor choices along the line, and I just felt there was more work to be done in terms of preventing some of this stuff from happening in the first place.
Right.
And that's when I moved into learning and development, and it started with just management training, and then built up to now where I run a number of leadership development programs. We're trying to introduce much more of a coaching culture within our organization. We've just got our first faculty of in-house coaches who have done the Academy of Executive Coaching's practitioner diploma. So it feels like we're on the verge of another big push forward. But yeah, I mean, coaching it's such an important part of who I am now, really. I think it was such an important moment back in 2006, and that has been a thread running throughout the latter part of my career, and introducing that at all levels, because I just felt wow when I learned it. And gosh, I just wished I'd have had that opportunity to learn that stuff when I'd first started. So I kind of want to do that. I want to get coaching skills to as many people as possible. And there's so much fascinating work going on out there. I was talking to somebody who's run a whole business around reaching kids at school. Imagine learning coaching that early, and the skills, because they're so useful in all parts of life, not just work. So yes, anyway, I digress.
If you by the way, if you or anybody listening figures out how I can coach my own children any better, then I'm all ears. But all joking aside, I completely agree that the application of that at a much younger age would be I can see the huge benefits. If you don't mind me saying, it's really interesting to hear you describe finding a good fit with coaching. That's what I'm kind of getting a sense of. You had this experience in 2006 and then still went through some other experiences, but that not having to advise and that not really feeling like that's what you like to do, but also with the just wanting to see the potential in people rather than even in the disciplinary situation. You can see how I always say to people, I think coaching attracts a certain type of person, with certain values and seeing potential, and all of those things form part of that wider discussion. But it's really interesting to see how, we all try things in our career, and once we find that fit, and it seems like coaching was one of those fits.
Absolutely. And when, later on in my career, when I first started to really seriously look at how we develop leaders within our organization, I knew that coaching had to play a really important role in all of that. And then at that stage, that's when I did the practitioner diploma myself. That's when I got qualified as a coach, and that's when I thought I knew all about coaching, having done this tiny which was hilarious when I look back. I thought, I'm going to be a grow coach. I'll use the grow model, because that's what what most people are introduced to, aren't they? Now, no disrespect to the grow model, I think it's a fantastic model, but then when I went on the practitioner diploma and was introduced to all these amazing different coaching models, ways of doing it, and then the connections I started to see between like different approaches, and noticing how you feel about them and the energy you feel, and what connects and what doesn't, and being curious about all of that. I mean I'm still I'm still like that to this day, really, because there's
Yeah.
so much stuff out there, isn't there?
There is, yeah.
And really pioneering, innovative stuff as well. That, you know, so it's like a playground, isn't it? There's lots of different, you know, different models and ways of approaching coaching that keep it, you know, really exciting. It's a really exciting space to work in.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you've got that natural curiosity and passion for it, yeah, it's a wonderful thing. I might ask you about your sort of coaching style as we sit here now in a moment, and what you've taken real influence from. But just before we do that, just kind of in your position as group head of talent development at the theatre group, you mentioned there coaching, you know, trying to develop a coaching culture, and I hear a lot of people talking about that, you know. Let's try and develop a culture of coaching in an organization, which, you know, 100% behind. I just wonder how you define that in terms of what that looks like for your organization, and what the benefits would be of, you know, day to day. What would that look like?
Well, I think, you know, as you mentioned the word curiosity, didn't you? And I think most organizations, and I think particularly post-pandemic as well, there is a need for far more creativity, isn't there? You know, we've had to rethink so many parts of our lives, and businesses have had to rethink, you know, just in terms of the working from home and working from the office.
Yeah.
So much has changed, and it requires flexibility and adaptability, and creativity. So we do need those things more than ever, I think, in organizational life. And so some of those old paradigms of leadership and you know, organizational development, I don't think they're playing as well as they used to. So, and I think coaching, because it is all about being curious, because it is all about asking questions, you know, listening. If you apply those much more broadly, well, actually, any business that has customers need to listen to their customers. They need to be asking the right questions. And it's not something to just be done, you know, once. You know, it has to be done all of the time. And so much stuff is now emergent, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
You know, emergent trends in business and all the rest of it. That to me, you've got to have a culture within an organization that can cope with all of that and can cope with all of that change. And so for me, the fundamental skills that will allow us to weather whatever changes and you know, stuff like that in the future, it is coaching. Yeah, so it's hard to do. And I think, you know, for generational points of view as well, it can be tough when somebody's had you know, a lot of experience in one way of doing things.
Yeah.
It can be really challenging to start introducing a concept where, you know, as a leader, you might enter a room and ask a question and then be quiet.
Yeah, imagine that.
And listen. That is hard for a lot of senior leaders, because they're used to, you know, holding the space and filling the space with a lot of words and vision, which is great. But there's a lot to be said as well for like maximizing the creativity and talent of all of the people in the meeting room.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the minute you share your view first, if you're the most senior person in the room, the chances are everyone else will just be quiet.
Yeah,
and you've shut down and you've lost that opportunity of hearing, you know, all those other ideas, all of those other contributions that could be much, much better than yours.
Yeah, interesting. And you're so right. It's the amount of habits that have to be broken in order, and it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it, saying it, but to be able to listen well, deeply, properly, even, it can be quite a barrier for people. And team meetings are let's face it, they're the worst for that, aren't they? I mean, even if you take out a dominant leader and it's just a group of peers, it's a competitive environment, isn't it? Who can get there, who can shout loudest, who, everyone's waiting for their turn to speak rather than listening to each other. So, yeah, I think that there's many situations, it made me reflect there, where just being able to hold the space and listen to others would be beneficial, shall we say. But
yeah, and it's building those relationships, isn't it? It's building
Mm.
trust. It's allowing it's allowing people to have a voice. And a lot of the really important issues facing all organizations now around inclusion and diversity,
Yeah.
again, I think those would be served much better from a coaching culture standpoint.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's a silver bullet for everything, but I do see, things do seem to circle back to it.
Yeah. How would you describe your coaching style then, Paul? You mentioned a moment ago that when you were qualified, that it opened, your eyes to this whole world of different coaching models and philosophies and things like that. But what did you take influence from, and what stuck with you as far as your coaching practice?
Looking back to when I did my practitioner diploma, I mean, we were asked two seemingly simple questions: who am I, and how am I going to coach? And I'll never forget those. And being introduced to different coaching models and approaches, I suddenly as I said, it kind of really opened my eyes to the diversity of approaches within coaching. And I started to recognize that there were certain coaching approaches that really felt comfortable, more comfortable than others, I suppose. And it was those things that, so for example, when we started to look at Gestalt, which was a massive influence for me, using some of the creative coaching and creative approaches to coaching within that, did remind me a lot of some of my acting training way back when. Actually, some of the techniques like chair work, where you ask somebody to kind of imagine they're talking to an empty chair and it's this person, and having a conversation with them, and then swapping over and sitting in that chair and being that person. It felt like one of those rehearsal techniques when you're trying to find your character. And it reminded me a bit of like Stanislavski's work around naturalistic acting and trying to find the truth within acting. And of course that's very transferable to coaching, because in many respects, aren't we asking our coachees to dig deep and find their character? And within Stanislavski, he talked about objectives and super objectives, so it even sounds a bit like business coaching, doesn't it? So these interesting connections started to form in my head as we were doing it. And I love some of the creative techniques of using drawing, which again spoke to me from back to childhood, when I loved drawing and painting and all of those, which I still love. And there are all these techniques, and what I started to notice as well were those moments within coaching. I get this kind of physiological reaction where when somebody has that wonderful moment of insight, where their face kind of lights up, and it is that light bulb moment. And I noticed within coaching, as the coach, I felt this kind of tingle. It kind of starts somewhere like back of the head, near the ears, a tingling, and it just kind of ripples and it goes right down my spine. And it's this really exciting moment. And it's the same kind of experience I get when I'm in the theatre and I'm watching an incredible performance, where if it's a musical, somebody hits that perfect note and you just get that tingle, or if it's a play, something incredible happens, a performer just does something in the moment. And of course, theatre and coaching, it's all about what's happening in the here and now, in the moment, that connection. In the theatre, it's between the performers and the audience, and you feel it. But in the coaching space, again, it's that connection, and you do feel it. It's a physiological thing for me, and I discovered that through my training, and it was just we were introduced to lots of different techniques as well. Some music was introduced at one point, and I'll never forget. It was just for an exercise to kind of think about how we were going to coach, and it was a piece by Ennio Morricone, a film composer, and I just thought, I absolutely love film music.
He wrote the score. Did he write the score for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly?
That's right. Yeah. And the piece they played was from I think it was from Cinema Paradiso, and I recognized it. And then I remembered my love of film music, and that's about deep listening. I love orchestral film music because of the layers of instrumentation, and I love I could listen to it over and over again, because you just pick up different things from percussion to the string section, and how parts of the orchestra will play together at one point, but then there's counterpoint, and loads of really interesting stuff. And again, that calls upon so when it became time to look at my coaching model, music is an important part of it, because I guess it's from a listening point of view. When you're listening to people, properly listening in coaching, there's a musicality in people's voices, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the way people emphasize stuff, or how they could say something, but the music to it is off.
Yeah.
It's listening for all of those things, I think, is incredibly powerful. So I think what my training provided me was this opportunity to make those kind of really personal connections, so that you can start to own your coaching model. Well, you had to create it first of all, but then it's about owning it, and and working with it and constantly developing it.
It's so interesting, as someone who's recently went on the journey of connecting my own passion with coaching, but it took me 7 years to realize after my coach training. It's really interesting to hear somebody else who had this experience of art. I've written down art, film, theatre, acting, writing, all that creativity to suddenly arrive at, and you can completely see, for those watching and listening who know about Gestalt, completely see the connection with what you've described, the physical sensations, the creative experimentation. And that I'd never really thought about chair work and stuff, because I'm not a trained actor. I haven't been through acting training, but I can see how that there are similarities.
And spaces in the room as well. And that's another classic technique,
right?
Of find a space in the room of where you are right now. I mean, that is like that's like a rehearsal room technique. But
to marry all of that passion that you've got for all of those things and make it fit with coaching as part of your training, really, as part of that learning, is well, personally, and this is an opinion, I'm sure you'll have your own views of how you describe it, but what I say to a lot of coaches who I'm working with in development and stuff is, and you hear it a lot, be authentic, don't you, as a coach, be yourself. And there are boundaries to coaching, which we shouldn't cross, but within that there's a lot of freedom to bring your own style, your own personality. And I think your story perfectly emphasizes that. You've made the connection between your passion, and it forms part of your coaching practice. That's my take on what you've just shared. But yeah, I think really powerful, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's right, and I think to feel in tune, to
In
continue
tune,
the
yeah.
metaphor, but it's interesting. So there's somebody within our organization who started off as a carpenter in one of our theaters, actually, and is now a qualified coach as part of our faculty.
Right.
And he used this and he's brilliant at metaphors, and he used this analogy of well, he loves obviously working with wood and creating things, and he's so passionate about that in particular.
Yeah.
But what he described was when you plane wood,
Yeah.
you go with the grain.
Yeah.
You follow the grain.
Yeah.
And he says when you're following the grain, it is beautiful and the sound is fantastic. You get these beautiful shavings that come off. The smell of the wood is incredible, and everything feels right. And he said when you're going against the grain, the noise is different, it even smells different, and it feels wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's I really like that metaphor, because I think
Totally.
probably we've all had times where we felt we're going against the grain, whether that's in coaching or in leadership or anything really in life. And I think, and a key point I think for coaches is, you've got to really dig deep into who you are, and do the work on self, which is never really completed.
Yeah.
But you do need to know yourself well enough,
Mhm.
and push yourself, I think. And sometimes, get curious about the things that you're frightened about, or the things that you might reject out of hand. Because I remember reading John Leary Joyce's book on Gestalt coaching, The Fertile Void, which is one of my favorite books on coaching of all time. But when I first started reading it, I just thought, this is really difficult, this is hard, I don't really get it, and I was about to give up. But I read it, and then I was on a train, and random things happen, and then everything just suddenly clicked. About the paradox of change and all that kind of stuff. But anyway.
Yeah, great. And I'd love to know, by the way, that metaphor, following the grain, is fantastic. I completely agree with that. And who better to hear it from than a carpenter, obviously. But just to delve a little bit more into the use of music, which I know you're very passionate about as well. I think when you're developing leaders in the organization, you've used creative techniques involving coaching and music and stuff. Would you just be able to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, as I say, I've always been really keen on film music. And the whole idea of film music is, it's not just film music, it obviously predated in classical music, but the idea of the leitmotif, which is, that certain characters, or actually sometimes it can be objects or places, can have their own theme. So a piece of music that describes them. So we're all familiar with it, aren't we? With famous films. So Indiana Jones has his own march. Princess Leia has her tune in Star Wars, that kind of thing. And I've always been interested in, because obviously real life doesn't have a soundtrack, but if it did, what would that be like? I think that's just a wonderful question to ask. Or if your organization had a theme tune, what would it sound like? It would be or asking groups.
That would be some interesting answers to that one.
It would be really interesting. But on a personal level, it's then so I've asked a question on a senior leadership development program called Leading Light. We asked them in our second week to think about the idea of leitmotif, and if they were to have their own piece of music for their leadership at its best, what would
Nice.
it sound like?
Yeah.
And the encouragement, the invitation there is to think about, well, first of all, if you were taking, if you're thinking about that now, what would your music like? What instruments, first of all, you might think about? Because instruments have a different feel, don't they? So is it going to be melodic as well? Is it going to have a tune? Is it going to be repetitive? Is it going to be, what's the rhythm going to be like? Is it going to be loud? Is it going to be soft? And so we set that as a task. We let coaches know as well, so they can have coaching conversations about it too,
Yeah.
to make their choice. And then we have this wonderful session where we ask them to, well, we play the piece of music, they try and guess whose it is.
Oh, do they?
and then they stand up
Nice.
and they do a presentation about what the music means,
Yeah.
what it means to them, and give it some flavor. And without fail, every time it's just a wonderful experience. And some of the most moving presentations I've ever seen have been around this. And one other big thing that I learned from this exercise is it's often the most unlikely person, I think, that has the most profound connection with this.
Right. Okay.
And I think there's something to learn from that. So, a lot of people say, well, I'm not creative, and I think this goes back to childhood and how we're kind of persuaded not to see ourselves as there's always that moment where you suddenly start to get criticized and then you withdraw from all of that kind of stuff. But one of the most powerful presentations was actually the first time we did it, and a very experienced leader got up and said, well, when I got the brief, I thought the first thing I was going to do was I was going to use a piece of music from the comedian Les Dawson. Don't know whether you
Yeah.
So Les Dawson used to do this skit in the 70s, 80s where he would play a piano and like get all the notes wrong, and it was slightly off, but it would be hilarious. Anyway, he said I was going to use a piece of music from Les Dawson, and I knew it would get a big laugh. And then I realized I do that a lot. I use humor as a bit of armor, actually, and a bit of a distraction. And so I'm not going to play a piece of music by Les Dawson. I decided to choose a different piece of music. And the piece of music he chose was called Spiegel im Spiegel, Mirror in the Mirror, I think it translates as. And it's such a beautiful piece of music, a kind of repeating pattern between piano and violin. And he said, so my leadership style isn't big and it isn't showy, but I think what I provide is a sense of safety in my leadership, a sense of calm. I kind of methodical. I work through things at a pace which is helpful. But most of all, this piece of music reminds me of my why. It reminds me of why I work in theatre. And when I listen to this piece of music, I see the image of a father leaving the theatre, holding hands with his daughter. And I feel a bit full up just saying it, because it was so moving and unexpected. And to use a theatrical phrase, there wasn't a dry eye in the house as he spoke about this. And then one of his peers said, I've known you for 15 years and it feels like I've seen you for the first time.
Wow.
So it was a really beautiful moment. And I think that leader as well really connected with their why through the music. And this person was famed for their spreadsheets and all that kind of stuff. But here we got to the emotional heart of why he did, why he does what he does.
Yeah.
And it was such an incredible moment, and one which we wouldn't have expected from that particular individual. And that's a note, really, isn't it? That we can make assumptions about people and their degree of creativity or their degree of engagement with creative activities.
Yes.
But it shouldn't stop us trying in some instances, because you can never predict. And we should never predict, should we?
Right. Yeah,
What's
yeah.
going to happen. So you kind of offer these things up lightly, and then suddenly you'll be presented with incredible work like that.
The cliched thing that we hear from people that you mentioned before is, I'm not creative. And I think when we talk about creativity as coaches, which what you've just described is just a fabulous example of, you'll often hear some coaches saying the same, well, I'm not creative, so how could I be creative in coaching? But what you've just described is basically a very straightforward premise, really, which is doesn't require any creativity on behalf of the HR team, or indeed the coach. If it was using a coaching context specifically, all the creativity happens with the coachee, with the client, but we're just giving them something more than words, right? Things that evoke feelings and emotions and that people connect with. And as if we were then coaching that person, what do we have to do? Just ask questions and listen. So in many ways, it's no different from, we can call it this creative coaching thing and make it sound very different, but actually what we're there to do doesn't change at all. It's just there's something else there to stimulate, or whatever other word we could choose to use to get that insight or reflection out of people.
That's absolutely right. I mean, it's about using these techniques, and not all the time, but you can use them to unlock so much more, because I think it activates a different part of our brains.
Yeah, I agree.
And particularly when clients are getting really stuck with something, that's when these interventions can make all the difference. Using objects, getting somebody to map out their system with random objects. I mean, that is incredible. And there is something, I think, about connecting adults with that childlike state of play.
Yeah.
If we think about when we were children, we made sense of the world through play, didn't we?
That's right. Yeah.
And it's where, as a child, we probably had most control in our lives, moving toys around on the carpet or wherever you. We could decide where these people would be. If you had well, I had my Star Wars figures there. You were in control of that. And you could use your imagination. And I think there's something really beautiful about encouraging adults to do that. And suddenly how empowering it is to be able to move things around and try things out in a really safe, playful way. So yeah, that's another big theme and part of my model is around that playfulness, creativity, but also childhood story, because there's great things from our childhood, but also stuff that gets in the way. And that's why we need to do work on self too, in terms of, making sure we've got positive narratives, and you can help others work with that as well.
Yeah. Fabulous. It's such a great example. I'm really grateful that you shared it, because I think, whether it's a leadership development program as the context in which you just shared, or whether it's at the start of a coaching relationship, or whether it's in the middle of an exploration and it just needs something else to help break through something or create a different reflection. I think, as you know, I'm a big fan of those sorts of things, but such a great example. I just wonder if, just to kind of start to bring our conversation to a close, Paul, if you had in mind any thoughts, any advice, I suppose, for practitioners, old and new, I suppose, in terms of further developing their practice and what that would be.
I'm always a bit reluctant about giving advice.
I'm getting that, yeah. That's why we're coaches.
Yeah. I think, well, from a personal perspective, I think the key thing for me has been about, being prepared to do the work on self, just to repeat my final point. I just think it's really important, and to continue that, knowing yourself well enough. And it's really interesting. I think I've done quite a lot of work on childhood stories, so the stuff that Dr. Sarah Hill's work. She's got a fantastic book called Where Did You Learn to Behave Like That, which is all about how we've all got childhood stories. We all have stories of imperfect love, really, no matter how happy your childhood was. And from my coaching experience, I know so many people have issues, I suppose, that have been that go way back. Silly things like presentation skills. People have this fear of public speaking because way back in school, some teacher said something unkind, or they got up and did something and a group of kids were unkind to them. And we hold those stories we can't change, but they then turn into a narrative, an old internal narrative that doesn't really get looked at until it becomes a real barrier. So that kind of work on self, understanding what your narratives are as well, I think is really important when you're coaching, because sometimes you can get triggered by things. Or sometimes something can really resonate because it reminds you of your own story. So I think work on self is really important, and some of the childhood story work, I believe as well, can really really build your confidence, because actually, and this fits in with my love of storytelling and theatre and all the rest of it, but and I love working with story as well with people. So I think that's just a really positive way to keep checking in on yourself as well. That who am I question is a really important one. Because it will show up in one way or another in how you create a space with a coachee, how you react, the types of questions you ask, all sorts of things. So keep doing the work on self would be my advice. Doesn't have to be childhood story work, but keep the reflection going, applying it to your model, and keep going back to your model, really. Mine has served me really well, and it continues to inspire me, and it continuously evolves as well. It gets more texture as you go along, more color, and I think that also is important to maintain that passion and connection with what you're doing.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, great advice. It starts with us, right? As coaches, it starts with us. Yeah, I love that. Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for spending some time talking to us, and thanks for being a guest on the podcast.
No problem at all. It's been an absolute pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.